I may have just set a new world record for being the most hated neighbor in suburban history because I shut off water to 342 homes right in the middle of a brutal Texas summer heat wave. But honestly, they kind of had it coming. They ran a pipeline straight through my land without asking. So now I'm sitting on my porch, sipping iced tea, watching Cynthia, the HOA president with $300 hair highlights, turn beet red as she stands at my door, practically begging me to turn the water back on. I don't say a word. I just smile and take another slow sip. Before I dive into how Cynthia almost fainted on my front porch, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. And believe me, you'll want to stick around because this story takes some wild turns you won't believe. Becoming a rancher was never part of my plan. For over 10 years, I was deep in the tech world, living in Silicon Valley and designing software to help companies track shipments. It wasn't flashy work, but it was steady, well-paying, and gave my mind something to chew on. Everything changed the day I got the call. My father had passed away from a heart attack, no warning. By the time I flew back to Texas, he was already gone. The funeral was a blur, people I barely knew. Old friends of his sharing stories I'd never heard. It hit me how little time I'd spent with him during those last few years. As his only child, I inherited the Morgan family ranch, 15 acres of dusty Texas land that had been in our family for 3 generations. By Texas standards, it wasn't a sprawling estate, but it was ours. My dad had worked it up until his last breath. His weathered hands told the story of a man who valued hard work and believed that the land always gave back what you put into it. My mother, Peggy, tried to convince me she could manage things on her own. But at 68, even her stubborn determination had its limits. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset pour golden light across the hills, she said softly, "Your father always believed this land would be here for you when you were ready to come home." I looked out at the oak trees, the gentle slopes, and the creek weaving through the grass. Something shifted in me. Maybe this was what I'd been missing. Something real, something rooted. So I took a sabbatical from my tech job. I figured I'd spend a few months down here reconnecting with the land and figuring out whether I wanted to stay or sell. What I didn't expect was to be drawn into a full-blown neighborhood feud before I could even unpack my bags. The drama began exactly 2 weeks after I moved in. I found a sleek white envelope in the mailbox. Embossed on the front was a gold logo I didn't recognize. Inside was an invitation to a welcome to the neighborhood event hosted by the Clear Hollow Ridge HOA at their community center. Clear Hollow Ridge was the luxury subdivision that had sprung up next to our property about 5 years ago. Dad used to grumble about it over the phone. They build their fancy houses right next to a working ranch and then complain about the smell of real life, he'd mutter. Turns out he wasn't exaggerating. I thought about tossing the invitation in the trash, but my mom encouraged me to go. "Your father never gave them a chance," she said with a soft sigh. "Maybe it's time for a fresh start." Wanting to humor her, I reluctantly agreed. In hindsight, I should have trusted my gut and stayed home. The Clear Hollow Ridge Community Center was sleek and modern with tall glass windows overlooking a carefully designed lake that gave the illusion of nature. I walked in wearing my best jeans and a clean button-down, only to realize I was severely underdressed. Everyone else looked like they were headed to a charity gala cocktail, dresses, tailored suits, and air-kissed greetings all around. That's when she appeared. A tall woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and a practiced smile floated toward me. "You must be Eli Morgan," she said, extending a hand glittering with a diamond ring. "I'm Cynthia Lilton, president of the Clear Hollow Ridge Homeowners Association." "We're delighted you could make it." Her tone was warm, but her eyes were cool, calculating. Behind her stood an older man, stern and silent, whom she introduced as Richard Coleman, HOA vice president and a retired attorney. Our introduction was brief. Within minutes, Cynthia was ushering me toward a quiet spot by the window, the lake glimmering behind her. "Mr. Morgan, Eli, may I?" She began, her voice honeyed. "We were very sorry to hear about your father. He was quite a character." The pause before character didn't go unnoticed. "Let me be candid. Your ranch, while charming in its own way, has become a concern for our community." She motioned subtly toward the tree line that separated our land from the sprawling homes beyond. "It's about property values," she said, her tone now clinical. "Some of our residents feel that the rustic look is a bit out of place. We've received several complaints." Richard, still silent, gave a grave nod. So Cynthia continued, "We'd like to make you an offer to purchase the land. Clear Hollow is planning to expand our recreational space and your property is the perfect fit. Then she named the price shockingly low, not even close to what the land was worth. Maybe they thought I wouldn't know better. She smiled like she'd done me a favor. I took a sip of the sparkling water she'd handed me, buying a moment. Cynthia, I said evenly, I appreciate the offer, but the ranch has been in my family for generations. I'm not selling. Her smile faltered for just a second, then returned tighter. I understand nostalgia, Eli. I really do. But let's be realistic. You're not a rancher. You're a tech guy, right? What will you do with all that land? This offer is more than fair considering the current condition. I felt a spark of irritation but kept my tone civil. Once again, thank you. But the answer is no. I need to get back. My mom's waiting. I turned to leave, but she reached out and rested her manicured hand on my arm. Think it over, Eli. Being neighbors can be pleasant or not. I'd hate to see us start off on the wrong foot. Her voice was syrupy, but the warning underneath was clear. The mask had slipped, if only for a second. And I knew then this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. As I drove back to the ranch, I kept replaying the conversation with Cynthia over and over in my head. What exactly had Dad been putting up with all those years? When I told Mom about what had happened, she let out a deep sigh that seemed to come from years of frustration. They've been trying to get your father to sell for a long time, she said quietly. At first, it was friendly, neighborly suggestions, offers over coffee. But it didn't stay that way. Just last summer, they sent him 15 different violation notices for supposed code infractions. And we're not even part of their HOA. She stood up and walked into Dad's office, returning a few minutes later with a worn, overstuffed folder. Inside were neatly filed documents, each with an official header listing supposed violations, everything from overgrown shrubs to storing tools in plain sight. I flipped through them slowly, feeling my jaw clench tighter with every page. This is harassment, I said, my voice low. Mom nodded gravely. Your father never took it lying down. He kept every letter, said someday he might need proof. She looked at me with a complex expression, part pride, part concern. I suppose now they think you will be easier to pressure. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I closed the folder and stared at it for a moment. First step, I said, finally, I need to call someone who knows the game. Sarah Martinez had been a sharp legal mind since our college days at UT Austin. Now she was one of the top real estate attorneys in the county. We met the next morning at a local diner. Over coffee and hash browns, I handed her the folder. She flipped through the papers with a practiced eye. Classic intimidation, she said, adjusting her glasses. They don't have a legal leg to stand on. Your ranch isn't part of their HOA, so you're not subject to their rules or covenants. These letters legally meaningless. She tapped the top of the stack with her finger. Still don't make the mistake of thinking they can't cause trouble. HOAs are masters at using social and logistical pressure. What's your plan, Eli? I took a breath. I'm still figuring that out. But I know one thing I'm not selling. Not to them, and especially not for some discounted offer so they can slap in a golf course. That land meant everything to my father. It deserves better than that. Sarah gave a firm nod. Then let's protect it. Document every single interaction. Save every letter, every email, every voicemail. And get a new land survey done. Establish your boundaries beyond dispute. As we said goodbye in the parking lot, she paused, her hand on my arm. And check your fences. A lot of disputes start when property lines suddenly get misunderstood. She was more right than I could have known. Over the next few weeks, things were quiet. I settled into ranch life, slowly learning the ropes, mending fences, hauling supplies, clearing out brush. It was tough, sweaty work, but something about it grounded me. I began to understand what my dad had loved about this place. Then came Tuesday morning. I was walking the southern edge of our property, right where our land bordered Clear Hollow. Something caught my eye, fresh soil, disturbed earth that didn't match the rest of the land. Curious, I followed the line. My stomach sank. A narrow pipeline had been laid, freshly buried, running from the creek on our land directly toward the back of the Clear Hollow development. I called Sarah immediately, and she arrived less than an hour later with a county surveyor in tow. As she stepped out of her car and saw the pipeline, her expression darkened. She began snapping photos from every angle. This is blatantly illegal, she said, crouching beside the fresh dirt. They've trespassed on your property and installed infrastructure without permits or permission. The surveyor confirmed her suspicions. The pipeline sat well within the boundary of our land. What's it even for? I asked, examining the spot where it ducked under our fence. Sarah glanced at the direction it led. My guess, water. That creek on your property feeds into a local aquifer. Clear Hollow likely tapped into it to support their artificial lake and fancy irrigation systems. And while Texas water law is complex, one thing's for sure, they can't just lay a pipeline through your land without a formal easement, legal clearance, and compensation. Fueled by a mix of disbelief and anger, I drove straight to the Clear Hollow Community Center that afternoon. I requested an urgent meeting with Cynthia. After nearly half an hour of waiting in a pristine, overly air-conditioned lobby, I was finally led into her office. She greeted me with her signature, polished smile. Eli, have you reconsidered our offer? Without a word, I laid the printed photos of the pipeline on her desk. Her smile faltered, and she shifted slightly in her chair. And what is this supposed to be? She asked, her tone turning cool. It's a pipeline, I said, my voice level. Your HOA installed across my land without permission. I'm giving you formal notice. I want it removed immediately, or I'll be pressing trespassing charges. Her smile vanished. That's a very serious accusation, Mr. Morgan. We have the necessary easements for our water infrastructure. If there's any confusion about the property line, I'm sure we can resolve it peacefully. There's no confusion, I replied, sliding the surveyor's official report across her desk. This pipeline is 27 feet inside my property. We had it verified just this morning. She skimmed the document, her expression unreadable. These matters are rarely as simple as you believe. Our development has established water access rights, many of which predate your inheritance. If you want to make this a legal matter, you should be prepared for an extended fight. These things can drag on for years. It was the second time she'd threatened legal warfare, this time with fewer pretenses. I stood. You have 48 hours to produce documentation showing any legal easement, or I'll expect to see removal crews on site. That's non-negotiable. As I walked toward the exit, her voice followed me. You're making a mistake, Eli. Your father learned how things work around here. Eventually you will too. But I didn't stop. As I stepped into the parking lot, a man approached, glancing nervously over his shoulder. Mr. Morgan, he said in a hushed voice. Name's Mike Hansen. I live in Clear Hollow. Look, I can't be seen talking to you, but you need to know HOA's been charging us special fees for the last year. $300 a quarter per household. Said it was for upgrading our water system to make the community independent. He handed me a folded newsletter with a highlighted section outlining the water infrastructure improvement assessment. Then with a tight nod, he added, a lot of us have been asking where the money's actually going. No one's gotten a straight answer. Before I could speak, he was already turning away. You didn't see me. I was never here. Sarah's investigation confirmed what we had already suspected. There was absolutely no record of any easement permit or legal agreement allowing Clear Hollow to install that pipeline. They hadn't even attempted to go through proper channels. They just took what they wanted, likely assuming my father wouldn't have the resources or strength to push back. And now they were charging hundreds of residents quarterly fees under the guise of improving a water system they had no legal right to access. This isn't just about trespassing anymore, Sarah told me, as we sat in her office surrounded by stacks of legal documents. If they've been collecting money from homeowners under false pretenses, that could rise to the level of fraud. I leaned back in my chair, taking it all in. So what do we do next? Her eyes were steady, her voice resolute. We gather everything, video, written records, surveys. You need to install cameras along your property, and we'll start calculating exactly how much water they're taking from you and what it's worth. Water rights in Texas aren't just legal matters, they're big business. If they've tapped your creek to support the entire neighborhood, we may be talking about serious liability. That night, I sat with my mom and walked her through what we had uncovered. She listened quietly, then nodded, her expression heavy with memories. Your father had a feeling something was wrong. Last summer during the drought, he told me the creek was running lower than it should have been. He planned to look into it, but... Her voice faded, her eyes misting. I gently took her hand. It's okay, Mom. We'll make it right. What I didn't say was how exactly I planned to do that, but in my head the wheels were already turning. By the next afternoon, I had high-resolution security cameras installed along the entire southern boundary, cleverly disguised as birdhouses. Just 3 days later, those cameras delivered gold. At 2 a.m., a team of workers crossed onto our land under the cover of darkness. Leading them was Brad Thompson, Clear Hollow's facilities manager. They worked quickly, digging up a wider section of the pipeline and installing what looked like a new pumping station at the creek's edge. The real bombshell came when Brad held his phone up and said, "Yes, Miss Lilton, we're upgrading it now. This should boost capacity by about 30%. Cynthia's involvement on video. I immediately shared the footage with Sarah, who filed for an emergency injunction the same day. This is what we needed, proof of continued trespass after a formal warning," she said. "This strengthens our case immensely." But while we waited for the court to respond, Cynthia wasn't sitting still. Whispers started floating around town, strange, untrue rumors. At the grocery store, Mrs. Finley, a sweet woman who had known my parents for years, asked, "Is it true you're setting up a Bitcoin mining facility on the ranch?" At the local barbershop, someone mentioned hearing I was selling the land to a commercial developer for a waste processing plant. The misinformation spread fast, and the source wasn't hard to guess. Then came the first official knock. A county inspector named Thomas Green showed up unannounced, citing vague complaints about unauthorized construction. He poked around, found absolutely nothing, then left with a polite smile. But the message had been sent. Cynthia's influence extended well beyond the HOA boardroom. And the real fight was only just beginning. A few days later, I received a certified letter formally inviting me to speak for the Clear Hollow HOA board. The stated reason: environmental concerns stemming from the condition of the Morgan property. It was clearly a setup, an attempt to put me on the defensive in hostile territory. But I decided to go anyway. I wasn't going to be intimidated. With Sarah by my side and a recording device tucked safely in my jacket pocket, I walked into that meeting fully expecting an ambush. And that's exactly what it was. Cynthia had packed the room with riled-up homeowners. As soon as we arrived, the lights dimmed and a slideshow began playing a series of carefully chosen images that made our working ranch look like a junkyard. Overgrown brush stacks of wood-old farm equipment, all of it presented with dramatic music and exaggerated captions. As you can see, Cynthia began in her smooth, practiced tone. The current state of the Morgan property poses several community concerns: fire risk, pest attraction, and overall harm to our neighborhood's aesthetic appeal. She paused for effect as murmurs of agreement swept through the crowd. Then she turned to me, eyes sharp despite her false smile. "Mr. Morgan, perhaps you'd care to share your plans for addressing these issues?" Her emphasis on the word plans wasn't subtle. She wanted me to reveal something, anything that could be twisted or used against me. I stood slowly, meeting the curious and skeptical gazes of dozens of homeowners. "Thank you for your concern," I said evenly. "I'm always open to discussing legitimate issues that affect the broader community. But before we dive into landscaping critiques, I'd like to address a more pressing matter, specifically the illegal pipeline your HOA has installed on my property, the water being siphoned without authorization, and the $300 per quarter your residents are paying for what amounts to theft." You could have heard a pin drop. Cynthia's smile faltered and Richard quickly stepped in. "Mr. Morgan, that's a serious allegation. Perhaps this is better handled in a private setting." I didn't flinch. "I have video evidence. It clearly shows your facilities manager expanding the unauthorized pipeline, all while speaking to Miss Lilton on a phone call confirming the upgrade. I'd be more than happy to play it for everyone here." A new kind of murmur spread through the room, confused, alarmed, and angry. Homeowners looked at one another, the realization beginning to take hold that something wasn't adding up. This wasn't the narrative they'd been sold about a routine infrastructure improvement. The meeting fell into chaos. Cynthia quickly moved to adjourn, but not before several residents stood up and blocked the exits, demanding answers about the water system fees. Sarah and I slipped out during the commotion, satisfied. The seeds of doubt had been planted deep within the HOA's membership. What I hadn't expected was how quickly Cynthia would retaliate. The very next morning, I found our tractor vandalized, its engine deliberately damaged. The cameras caught a pair of hooded figures trespassing around 2 a.m., pouring something into the fuel tank. Later that day, our mailbox was shattered. By evening, someone had spray painted the words, "Sell your land, hillbilly," in bold red letters across the front of our house. My mother stood silently as she stared at the damage. Then with a hard glint in her eyes, she said, "Your father built this house with his bare hands. No slick-talking real estate agent with delusions of grandeur is going to scare us off." I contacted Sheriff Miller and filed a report about the vandalism and trespassing. He listened patiently but seemed hesitant to take meaningful action. Look, Eli, he said, avoiding direct eye contact. I can't just go pointing fingers at Clear Hollow residents without solid evidence. His words were non-committal, but his body language said more than enough. Later that evening, I got a call from Mike Hansen, this time from a blocked number. He kept his voice low. Just so you know, the Sheriff's Department gets some pretty generous donations from the Clear Hollow Community Fund. Cynthia makes sure Miller knows exactly who keeps the wheels greased. It was disheartening, but not surprising. The next morning, my sister Jennifer pulled into the driveway. She'd taken time off from her job in Austin as an investigative journalist and didn't waste any time getting to work. You've been playing defense, Eli, she said, setting her laptop on the kitchen table. It's time to go on offense. She started digging into Cynthia's background and the HOA's financial trail. What she found raised serious red flags. Turns out Cynthia had served as president in 2 other residential developments before Clear Hollow, both of which had also struggled with water access. In both cases, neighboring properties were mysteriously hit with a wave of vandalism and relentless code enforcement, eventually selling well below market value. Then came the bombshell. Jennifer uncovered a document dated 2 years ago, an alleged agreement between Clear Hollow Ridge and Morgan Ranch granting water access rights. It bore what looked like my father's signature. My stomach turned. This is a fake, I said immediately. Dad would never have signed anything like this. We showed the document to Sarah. She examined the signature closely, comparing it to verified legal documents my dad had signed. It's not a perfect match. It's been traced or mimicked. This is highly suspect. Jennifer nodded. They probably forged it in case you pushed back. They wanted a fake paper trail to protect themselves. At that point, we weren't just looking at trespassing and water theft. We were staring down potential fraud and forgery. Then Jennifer uncovered something else, something game-changing. A small notice buried in the county water management bulletin revealed that the headwaters of the creek, the actual spring that fed the stream running through our ranch, was scheduled to be auctioned off in 30 days. If Clear Hollow acquired those rights, they could legally restrict our access to the water source or charge us to use it. Sarah's expression turned serious. Whoever owns the source controls the flow. If they get it, they'll own you. Jennifer leaned across the table, her eyes gleaming with determination. So we buy it first. I looked at Mom. She didn't hesitate. Do it, she said. Your father would have done the same. That was it. The trap was set. If Cynthia wanted to play dirty, she was about to see what real mud looked like. Buying the water rights had to be done quietly. If Cynthia caught wind, she'd surely try to outbid us. Sarah connected me with Dave Wilson, chairman of the local water board, who'd clashed with Cynthia before. She's been trying to control that spring since day one, he said with a scowl. Wine and dine tactics, promises of board seats. She's not subtle. Dave couldn't help us officially, but he explained how the auction process worked, knowledge that would prove invaluable. To stay anonymous, we formed a limited liability company, registering it to Sarah's office address. Then we submitted our sealed bid for the parcel. The price tag was steep, $45,000 for what looked like a patch of unremarkable land, but it came with something priceless: control over the water supply for a neighborhood full of multi-million-dollar homes. Sarah also introduced me to Olivia Parker, a sharp environmental attorney with a specialty in Texas water rights. Water law here operates under prior appropriation, she explained during our first meeting. It's a simple principle: first in time, first in right. Whoever holds the earliest valid claim to a water source has the legal advantage. By owning the headwaters, you're establishing priority. Clear Hollow can't just keep taking water, they'll have to come to the table. The purchase of the headwaters went smoothly. We were the only bidder, which meant Cynthia had likely overlooked the importance of the auction entirely. What looked like a barren, rocky hillside spring to most people was now ours, and it was a strategic win. Quiet, legal, and powerful. We made sure the purchase remained under the radar. The LLC name held the deed, and public records wouldn't link it back to us right away. But word spread fast. Dave told me that rumors had already reached Clear Hollow, sparking panic once they realized someone had acquired the spring. They just didn't know it was me. Cynthia unsurprisingly stormed into Dave's office demanding details. He recounted the interaction to me later with a smirk. She said it was an essential part of their long-term water strategy, he laughed. I told her public records would be available soon enough. That didn't go over well. Her next moves made it clear she wasn't taking the loss gracefully. Within days, my mom was harassed in town by a few Clear Hollow residents. They'd clearly been misled. One called her a selfish old woman for refusing to sell for the greater good. Mom's hands were shaking when she told me, but her voice was steady. "She's turning them against us," she said, "but I won't back down." The escalation continued. Brad Thompson and his crew were caught on camera extending the pipeline again, this time during the day. I drove straight over and confronted them on the spot. Brad didn't bother with pleasantries. "You don't know who you're messing with, tech boy," he sneered. "Miss Lelton has friends who can make your life hell. You're going to regret this." But I didn't back down, and that only made Cynthia double down. Soon after, she called an emergency HOA meeting and publicly labeled my family as hostile elements, jeopardizing the community's well-being. Thanks to Mike Hansen, we obtained the leaked meeting minutes. Cynthia had introduced a new community defense fund and announced a special assessment, $500 per household, to protect Clear Hollow's water security. She was bleeding them dry, all while casting us as the villains. Then came the most aggressive move yet. We received an official notice stating Clear Hollow was initiating eminent domain proceedings to seize a corridor of our land for the pipeline. The justification: essential public utility access. "They can't actually do this," Sarah assured me after reading the document. "HOAs don't have the authority to claim eminent domain. It's nothing more than a scare tactic, but the fact that they're resorting to this shows how cornered they feel." Jennifer had been chronicling everything, every incident, every document, every threat. She'd built a library of video content outlining the full scope of Clear Hollow's misconduct. It included aerial footage of the pipeline interviews with environmental experts and footage of Brad's trespassing. "We're almost ready," she told me. "When we go public, we're not just defending your land, we're going to expose them." That moment came sooner than expected. Dave Wilson called one morning, his voice low and serious. "Clear Hollow just filed for emergency permits. They're trying to claim grandfathered water rights based on that forged agreement you found. It's a last-ditch effort. They know what's coming." Just hours later, our cameras captured Brad Thompson and his crew cutting through our fence and tearing up part of the property to extend the pipeline. When I arrived on the scene to confront them, Sheriff Miller was already there, called by Cynthia, no doubt. But instead of stopping the obvious trespass, he stood by and watched, arms crossed, saying it was a civil matter and he couldn't intervene. "This is private property," I said firmly, barely able to contain my anger. "They're trespassing. They're destroying my fence." "That's a crime, Sheriff." Miller shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. "Now, Eli, it looks like there's some confusion. Clear Hollow claims they have access rights. They've got paperwork to back it up. Until a judge sorts this out, my hands are tied." "Forged paperwork," I snapped. "And you know it." But he didn't respond. Brad just smirked at me from behind the sheriff, his smug expression fueling the fire building in my chest. That was the moment I knew we'd exhausted every peaceful option. If the system wouldn't protect us, we would protect ourselves. It was time to bring out the big guns. Back at the house, we called an emergency strategy session. "We own the headwaters now," I reminded everyone. "What does that give us the right to do?" Olivia didn't miss a beat. "As the legal owner of the water source, you have priority water rights. You can control the flow for conservation and maintenance purposes. You can't be punitive, but you can install monitoring systems, regulate output for environmental protection, and restrict usage if unauthorized siphoning is harming your land." I looked at Mom, who had been quietly listening. She sat up straighter. "Your father would have said, it's time to remind them who they're dealing with. Morgans don't get pushed around." That was all the confirmation I needed. We spent 2 days installing a professionally engineered, remotely controllable valve at the spring. Every step was done by the book. We filed the permits, followed environmental guidelines, and submitted formal notice to the County Water Authority that essential maintenance and flow regulation were underway on a private water source. The system would allow us to limit or completely shut the flow from the headwaters into the downstream creek legally and on our terms. The project cost $26,000, but to me it was justice well spent. Following Olivia's legal advice, we documented every inch of the unauthorized pipeline. Photos, videos, timestamps. We prepared a detailed formal letter addressed to the Clear Hollow HOA, outlining the illegal installation, the unapproved water diversion, and our legal ownership of the source. In the letter, we demanded immediate removal of the pipeline and proposed a legitimate access agreement at market rates if they wished to continue using the water. They had 72 hours to respond, or we would take all available legal action. Their reply came faster than expected. A cease and desist letter arrived from Gregory Hoffman Clear Hollow's legal counsel. It claimed we were unlawfully disrupting the community's water access and threatened legal countersuits if we continued. The letter leaned heavily on the forged agreement, recycling vague accusations and veiled threats about significant damages. Sarah and Olivia read it together, then looked at me with matching expressions of calm certainty. "It's all smoke," Sarah said. "They're bluffing. They've got no standing and they know it." Olivia nodded. "This isn't law, it's intimidation. But they're running out of moves, and they knew it." The 72-hour deadline came and went with no real response from the Clear Hollow HOA. No apologies, no negotiations, nothing but silence and arrogance. That was our cue. On a blistering Tuesday morning in mid-July, with the forecast calling for 103 degrees heat, I stepped outside, took a deep breath, and pressed the button on the remote that activated the control valve at the headwaters. The effects weren't immediate. Clear Hollow had some reserve tanks, and it took a few hours for the consequences to trickle down. But by mid-afternoon, the signs of disruption started showing. The decorative fountains at the community entrance sputtered and stopped. By evening, their pristine, over-irrigated lawns were baking under the relentless sun as the sprinkler systems failed one by one. By the next morning, the situation had escalated. Residents began reporting dramatically low water pressure. In some homes, water stopped flowing entirely. Clear Hollow descended into chaos. On day 2, news vans gathered outside the development's gates. Cynthia, never one to miss a spotlight, gave an emotional interview portraying the community as the innocent victim of what she called water terrorism committed by a vindictive neighbor. She clutched a bottled water prop and spoke with dramatic pauses, painting herself as a champion of the people. "Families are suffering," she said, almost in tears. "Children can't bathe. Seniors are vulnerable in this extreme heat. All because one man refuses to cooperate with a thriving community." Nowhere did she mention the illegal pipeline, or the stolen water, or the forged documents. The first wave of media coverage skewed in her favor until that evening. That's when Jennifer launched our counterstrike. She released a carefully edited expose to several media outlets. The video featured time-stamped surveillance footage of the unauthorized pipeline construction, expert commentary explaining water rights, in prior appropriation interviews with environmental lawyers, and a clear explanation of the forged water access agreement bearing our father's faked signature. "This isn't about one man controlling water," Jennifer told reporters. "It's about an HOA president who abused her authority, stole resources, misled her community, and tried to bully a grieving family into silence." The tone of the media coverage quickly shifted. News outlets began asking tougher questions about Clear Hollow's water system, their history of special assessments, and the HOA's refusal to respond to legal inquiries. By day 3, tensions reached a boiling point. A crowd of angry residents marched up to our front gate, led by none other than Cynthia herself. She carried a bullhorn and shouted, "Turn the water back on." "Morgan, you're holding our entire community hostage." I stepped out to meet them at the gate. Jennifer filmed the entire encounter from our porch camera steady. "This is private property," I said calmly. "You're trespassing, and this is harassment." Cynthia marched up, her face red with heat and fury. "You're destroying our community. People won't forget that you took their water during a heat wave." I looked her straight in the eyes. "I'm managing the flow of water from a source I legally own. The same water your HOA has been stealing for years through an illegal pipeline installed without consent. Have you told your neighbors they've been paying special assessments for stolen water? Or about the document you forged using my dead father's name?" There was a beat of stunned silence. Then a murmur rippled through the crowd. Mike Hansen stepped forward. "Cynthia, is that true? Were we paying for stolen water?" Other voices followed, asking about the money, the forged signature, the truth. What Cynthia had intended as a show of force had backfired completely. The crowd she brought to condemn me was now looking to her for answers. Sensing the tension in the air, Sheriff Miller finally stepped up. "All right, folks," he called out, raising his voice just enough to be heard over the crowd. "This is a civil dispute, and it needs to be handled through the proper legal channels. I'm asking everyone to disperse peacefully before this becomes a public disturbance." Slowly, the crowd began to break up, grumbling, others casting uncertain glances at Cynthia. Once the street cleared, Miller approached me quietly. "The mayor's office called," he said, lowering his voice. "They want a meeting with both parties tomorrow. 9 HOA at City Hall. Let's see if we can sort this mess out before it gets worse." That evening, I received an unexpected call from Richard Coleman. His tone was strained, the usual edge of confidence noticeably absent. "Morgan, this has gone far enough," he said. "You've made your point. Turn the water back on as a sign of good faith, and we can work out a reasonable settlement." I didn't even hesitate. The time for reasonable negotiation was before you trespassed on my land, forged documents using my late father's signature, and vandalized my property. "I'll see you at City Hall tomorrow." After hanging up, I met with Sarah and Olivia to discuss our position going into the negotiation. As a calculated gesture of control, I remotely opened the valve for 6 hours that night, just enough for Clear Hollow residents to fill bathtubs and containers. It wasn't out of generosity. It was a tactical move to show I held the reins completely. The next morning, Jennifer showed me the online response to her videos. They had gone viral overnight. Clips of Brad's trespassing, Cynthia's tirade at the gate, and the breakdown of the forged water rights document had been shared thousands of times. The tide of public opinion had turned. Sympathy now rested squarely with us. We left for City Hall that morning with legal leverage, public support, and literal control of the water. I was no longer just a rancher, I was a water rights defender with a story the whole town was watching. City Hall loomed ahead, a grand limestone structure nestled in the town center. Inside, we were directed to the council chambers, an ornate room with polished wood tall windows, and a long oak table that stretched the length of the space. Mayor Robert Hayes, a seasoned leader with silver hair and a reputation for cutting through nonsense, had organized the meeting himself. His assistant, Andrea Wells, guided us to our seats on one side of the table. Moments later, Cynthia arrived, flanked by Richard Coleman and Gregory Hoffman, the HOA's sharp-suited attorney. None of them looked as confident as they had before. Mayor Hayes took his seat at the head of the table, flanked by 2 city attorneys and Dave Wilson from the Water Management Board. He scanned the room, his voice carrying firm authority. "Let's get straight to the point. We've got over 300 homes without consistent water access in the middle of a severe heat wave. There are serious allegations of unauthorized construction encroachment and what looks to be years of mismanagement. The city's reputation is taking a hit." Then he turned to me. "Mr. Morgan, is it true that you now control the water source and have restricted flow to Clear Hollow Ridge?" Sarah gave me a quick nod. "Yes, Mayor," I said clearly. "After discovering that Clear Hollow installed an illegal pipeline across my land, and after multiple ignored requests to resolve the matter peacefully, I legally purchased the spring that feeds the creek on my property. As its owner, I've temporarily restricted water flow while seeking resolution over the unauthorized infrastructure and damages caused." Mayor Hayes took a moment to study me, then turned to Cynthia. "Ms. Lilton, Clear Hollow maintains it has the proper authorization for access to the water source. Can you provide the relevant documentation?" Cynthia straightened in her seat, confidence emanating from her posture. "Absolutely, Mayor. Clear Hollow has upheld water access agreements with the Morgan property for several years." She nodded to Hoffman, their attorney, who slid a folder across the table. "This agreement, dated 2 years ago and signed by Mr. Morgan's late father, grants our community an easement for necessary water infrastructure." I tensed immediately, but before I could speak, Sarah gently placed a hand on my arm. A silent reminder, let the facts speak. Hoffman continued. "Furthermore, the water in question supports over 300 homes. This goes beyond a personal dispute. It qualifies as an essential public utility. Mr. Morgan's actions amount to a disruption of critical services." Mayor Hayes passed the document to his legal advisors, his expression unreadable. "And what about the allegations of property damage, trespassing, and harassment outlined in Mr. Morgan's file?" he asked, shifting his focus back to Cynthia. Her smile tightened ever so slightly. "Those claims are grossly exaggerated, Mayor. Our maintenance team has conducted routine upkeep on the infrastructure, always with community welfare in mind. If there's been any confusion about property lines, we're open to resolving that within the framework of a new agreement." I clenched my jaw. The audacity of the lie burned, but years in the tech world had taught me when to let the experts speak. Sarah leaned forward, her tone measured but resolute. Mayor Hayes, we have clear video documentation of Clear Hollow personnel trespassing on the Morgan property, cutting fencing, and expanding a pipeline that was never permitted. Additionally, we've logged multiple instances of harassment, including acts of vandalism and threatening behavior directed toward the Morgan family. For nearly an hour, the meeting continued in this vain point-counterpoint accusation denial. The mood in the room was tense, the city officials clearly uncomfortable as both sides dug in. Just when it seemed we had reached a standstill, the chamber doors swung open. Lisa Thompson walked in briskly. Apologies for the interruption, Mayor, but as a Clear Hollow resident, I believe our community deserves to be heard in these discussions. Behind her stood a group of a dozen residents, some holding folders and papers. Lisa held up a packet. We've gathered signatures from 120 households demanding financial transparency from the HOA board regarding our water assessments and calling for an independent audit of Miss Elton's leadership. The room erupted. Cynthia shot to her feet, her voice sharp and incredulous. This is a betrayal during a crisis. You're tearing this community apart. Richard attempted to defuse the situation, urging the mayor to dismiss the residents' concerns, claiming they lacked the necessary understanding of legal complexities. Mayor Hayes banged his gavel repeatedly, commanding order. That's enough, Ms. Thompson, while I acknowledge your group's concerns, this meeting was called to address the immediate water crisis. Governance issues within your HOA are outside the scope of today's discussion. Lisa didn't back down. With all due respect, Mayor, they're directly related. We've been paying hundreds in special assessments for years, and now we find out that money might have funded illegal infrastructure. That's not just mismanagement, it's fraud. And if the foundation of this dispute is corruption, then it absolutely matters here. While Hayes worked to regain control of the room, Sarah discreetly passed me a folded slip of paper. It was from Mike Hansen. I opened it under the table, and what I read made my pulse jump. The document revealed Clear Hollow's financial records. Cynthia had redirected over $200,000 from the HOA's water infrastructure budget over the past 3 years. The funds had been funneled into her personal home renovations and lavish vacations. This wasn't just a dispute over stolen water anymore. This was embezzlement on a grand scale. I handed the note to Sarah, who read it quickly before rising from her seat. Mayor Hayes, she said, composed and professional, we respectfully request a short recess to review urgent new evidence. The mayor granted it without hesitation. We gathered in a side chamber with Mike and Lisa, tension hanging thick in the air. I work in accounting, Mike began in a low voice. After the HOA meeting blew up, I started digging through Clear Hollow's financial records. What I've found so far, it's just the beginning. Cynthia's been skimming off every special assessment we've been charged for years. Lisa jumped in. And Brad Thompson came to my house last night. He was shaking, said he couldn't live with it anymore. He admitted Cynthia told him to forge your dad's signature on that supposed water agreement. Sarah's eyes lit up, her voice steady but urgent. This changes everything. If we get Brad's statement on record, we're not just talking about civil liability, we're talking about criminal charges. We need to move fast. When we returned to the council chamber, Sarah calmly stood and addressed the mayor. In light of new evidence, we're formally requesting that the city police department open an immediate investigation into potential fraud, forgery, and financial misconduct related to Clear Hollow HOA operations. Cynthia visibly snapped. This is outrageous, she shouted, her composure unraveling. This is nothing but a slander campaign orchestrated by a bitter neighbor and a few loud residents with personal grudges. Richard, tell them. But Richard Coleman suddenly seemed preoccupied with the paperwork in front of him, his eyes down, his lips sealed. Mayor Hayes, remaining composed, turned to his staff. Contact the district attorney's office. Given the nature of these allegations, this situation requires a revised approach. Then he turned to me. Mr. Morgan, the city still faces a public utility crisis. What are your terms for restoring immediate water access while this investigation unfolds? I had been preparing for this moment. 3 conditions, Mayor. First, complete removal of the unauthorized pipeline and related infrastructure from my property under county supervision. Second, a legitimate good faith negotiation of a water access agreement, including fair market compensation for past and future usage. And third, a public apology from the Clear Hollow HOA for the harassment, vandalism, and intimidation directed at my family. The mayor looked over at Hoffman and Richard, who were engaged in hurried whispers. Finally, Richard spoke up, his tone cautious but conciliatory. Speaking for the board, we can agree in principle to those terms pending a review of specifics. As the meeting drew to a close and a formal agreement began to take shape, Cynthia suddenly stood up, her voice dripping with venom. "This isn't over, Morgan." She snapped, her mask completely gone. "You think this little stunt means you've won? I still have friends in places you can't imagine. Enjoy your moment. It won't last." She turned and stormed out, leaving Richard behind to offer a strained apology for her emotional reaction. Afterward, Dave Wilson pulled me aside, a quiet note of satisfaction in his voice. "The Water Management Board will be launching its own investigation into Clear Hollow's violations, and with the DA circling Miss Elton's, going to be very busy." That evening, as promised, I reopened the valve, partially allowing water to flow to Clear Hollow for 6 hours a day while the formal agreement was drafted. Within days, the community called an emergency HOA meeting. Lisa, now armed with undeniable proof of embezzlement and misconduct, presented her case. The room was silent with shock. By an overwhelming vote, Cynthia and Richard were removed from the board pending investigation, and Lisa was elected interim president. Justice had finally started to flow just like the water. When I pulled into the driveway that night, Mom was already waiting on the porch swing, a glass of iced tea resting in her hand. She didn't say much, just looked at me with steady eyes and said, "Your father would be proud." The fight wasn't entirely over. Cynthia's final threat still echoed in my mind, a warning that she had one last move to make. But for that moment, right had triumphed over might, and peace, however fragile, had been earned. That peace held for exactly 9 days. In that time, Clear Hollow's new interim HOA board, with Lisa Thompson at the helm, worked closely with our legal team to draft a legitimate water access agreement. The illegal pipeline had been dismantled under county supervision, and plans for a regulated, sustainable system were underway. Most residents adapted to the scheduled 6-hour water flow without complaint, recognizing it as a temporary inconvenience on the path to something fair and permanent. Even Sheriff Miller had begun to investigate the vandalism on our property now that Cynthia's shadow no longer loomed over him. Everything was progressing smoothly, which should have been my warning. Cynthia wasn't finished. Then came the certified letter. The envelope bore the seal of the State Environmental Protection Division. According to the enclosed notice, there was an investigation underway into potential industrial chemical contamination in the creek running through our land. All water usage was to be halted immediately pending further review. The trigger alleged samples taken by none other than Thomas Green, the same inspector who had previously targeted us conveniently under Cynthia's influence. The timing was far too perfect to be coincidence. My phone lit up with calls, residents, reporters, even Mayor Hayes, all wanting answers about toxic water. During our emergency meeting, Sarah didn't mince words. "This is her final move," she said. "She wants to make it look like you knowingly poisoned the water." Olivia reviewed the paperwork and pointed out major red flags. Anonymous tips shouldn't trigger full shutdowns without corroborating lab confirmation. Meanwhile, Jennifer dug into Thomas Green's background. What she uncovered was damning. He'd previously been disciplined for falsifying reports and had long-standing ties to Cynthia through her ex-husband's company. "This reeks of her," Jennifer concluded. "We moved fast, hiring a certified private lab to collect independent samples, especially from the headwaters. We also requested expedited testing from the state's primary lab and had Mayor Hayes send a city engineer to oversee the process to ensure transparency. 48 hours later, the results were in. Our tests showed clean water at the source and throughout most of the ranch. But one specific section where the creek crossed into Clear Hollow contained chemical traces. Industrial solvents, not runoff. They had to be deliberately introduced. Someone planted it, Olivia confirmed after consulting environmental experts. These chemicals don't just show up in a creek. This was intentional. The evidence was compelling enough for Sheriff Miller to take decisive action. With the county prosecutor's approval, he obtained warrants to search both Thomas Green's office and Cynthia's home. What they uncovered shocked even the most cynical of us. Forged environmental reports, a check from Cynthia made out to Green, and in her garage, the very same chemicals used in the contamination, along with receipts dated just days before the incident. The charges that followed were staggering: forgery, fraud, environmental crimes, embezzlement, conspiracy. Cynthia was arrested at the airport attempting to flee to Cancun with a suitcase full of cash. As the legal proceedings began, Clear Hollow turned a corner. The new board finalized a fair, transparent water access agreement. We received formal recognition of our rights, along with a significant settlement for years of unauthorized use and property damage. But more importantly, Cynthia's culture of fear and intimidation dissolved. Lisa launched regular town hall meetings, opened the HOA's financial books, and prioritized transparency. The residents finally had a voice. Instead of pocketing the full settlement, I invested a portion into modernizing the ranch's irrigation system and building a sustainable model that served both sides of the property line. Mom suggested we dedicate part of the land to a nature preserve with educational programs, something my father had always talked about. He used to say, "We were just stewards of this land," she said softly. "Let's make sure we live that truth. Let's keep his spirit alive." In the months that followed, something unexpected happened. A partnership was born. Many Clear Hollow residents, burdened by guilt for their past silence, began stepping forward. Mike Hansen, once a quiet ally, now led volunteer days to help repair the damage done to our land. Fences were rebuilt. Erosion was addressed. Neighbors who once kept their distance now worked beside us with sleeves rolled up and apologies in their eyes. Jennifer's meticulous documentation of everything we had endured turned into a powerful investigative series. Her expose on HOA abuse, water rights, and local corruption went viral and was eventually honored with a National Journalism Award. It gave voice to others across the country who were dealing with similar abuse under the guise of community governance. And Sarah, what began as a professional alliance grew into something deeper. Built on long days in courtrooms, late nights in strategy meetings, and shared values forged under pressure, our relationship became more than just legal teamwork. It became personal. Exactly 1 year after I had first shut off the valve, everything had changed. Clear Hollow, once ruled by fear and secrecy, was now considered a model of community transparency. With Lisa Thompson as its president, the HOA was accountable, collaborative, and open. Public records were posted regularly, board meetings were live streamed, and residents had a real say in decisions. Our ranch thrived too. Using part of the settlement, we upgraded to eco-friendly irrigation systems, planted native grasses, and restored wildlife habitats. The creek, once a source of tension, now flowed freely and lawfully, with regulated systems providing water to both sides of the property. Everything was above board, monitored, and sustainable. Even the County Tourism Board took notice, featuring our region in a campaign promoting sustainable rural development and responsible land sharing. On a crisp fall evening, I found myself by the creek, seated on a wooden bench next to Mom with Sarah, Mike, and a few faces that had once been adversaries now sitting nearby as friends. We were gathered to celebrate the official opening of the Morgan Water Conservation Trail, a collaborative effort between our ranch and the Clear Hollow community. Children ran along the edge of the creek, laughter ringing through the air, where lawsuits and bullhorns once dominated. I raised a bottle of beer, watching the sun dip low over the water. Sometimes, I said, you have to shut the water off just to make people realize what it's really worth. Everyone nodded. We all knew that the resource that had once divided us wasn't just water. It was trust, respect, the ability to listen and live alongside one another without fear. The financial settlement could have easily sent me back to Silicon Valley, back to conference calls and analytics dashboards. But the thought of cubicles and quarterly reports no longer called to me. This land, scarred but healing, stubborn but beautiful, was home, and I belonged here. Dad always used to say, "The ranch will be here when you're ready." He never mentioned it would take a legal battle, a corrupt HOA president, and a community revolt to make me see that. As the creek sparkled in the golden light and the children laughed behind us, I imagined him standing somewhere nearby, arms crossed, that familiar grin on his face. He'd appreciate the irony, no doubt. Life has a way of teaching you what really matters, sometimes through hardship, sometimes through fire. And some battles are worth fighting, not because we choose them, but because they choose us. A few weeks after the Morgan Water Conservation Trail officially opened, just as the leaves began turning amber and gold across the hills, a new challenge quietly emerged, one I hadn't anticipated but couldn't ignore. It started with a phone call from Lisa. Her voice was calm but laced with tension. "Eli, we've got a situation. There's been a land development proposal filed with the county. A private equity firm, Stonebrook Holdings, they want to build a luxury resort and golf course on the land bordering both Clear Hollow and your ranch." I blinked. That area's been untouched for decades. Exactly. But the current owner is entertaining their offer. If they get approval, they'll need access to the creek. Your creek. I rub my temple, already feeling the headache forming. Do they even understand the water rights out here? They're trying to fast-track it through a loophole, claiming access to historical flow patterns. She said, "We need to meet tomorrow." The next day we gathered in the newly repurposed Clear Hollow Community Hall. Lisa, Sarah, Olivia, Mike, and two board members from the Water Management District. Jennifer joined via video call from Austin. We reviewed the development proposal and my heart sank. The plans were glossy, filled with buzzwords like eco-resort and sustainable design, but their projected water use was enormous, far beyond what the creek could support without harming our existing systems. "This isn't a resort," Olivia said bluntly. "It's a siphon. They're looking to pump your water into an artificial paradise that'll dry out everything around it within 5 years. And they're banking on you being too tired to fight," Sarah added. "This is a classic maneuver. Wait until the dust settles from one war, then quietly launch another." I sat back in my chair staring at the proposal. Just as things were settling into peace, greed was knocking again. "We have one major advantage," I finally said. "We have unity, Clear Hollow's board. Our legal team, the Water Management District, we've all been through this once before. This time we strike first." Over the next week, we built our case. We rallied local environmental groups who'd been inspired by our story. Jennifer ran a powerful editorial in several major Texas publications about the threat of unchecked development on rural ecosystems. Olivia filed a formal objection to the permit based on misrepresentation of water impact assessments. Sarah compiled evidence of precedent-setting rulings regarding water flow restrictions and private land rights. But perhaps the most effective move came from the people. At the county's open forum, over 300 residents showed up, many wearing shirts that read "Creek Before Concrete." Farmers, teachers, retirees, even school kids stood up and voiced their opposition to the development. Lisa gave a moving speech about the transformation of Clear Hollow and the value of long-term stewardship over short-term profit. Finally, I stepped up. "I'm not anti-growth," I began, "but growth should never come at the cost of community or conscience. My father taught me that land is a responsibility, water is a gift, and both deserve to be protected, not exploited. We fought once to protect this creek. We'll do it again if we have to." The vote was unanimous. The county rejected the permit. As the crowd cheered, I found myself once again humbled by the power of people coming together, not just to stop harm, but to stand for something better. Later that evening, back on the porch, Mom handed me a mug of cider. The stars were just beginning to emerge and the distant sound of crickets filled the air. "You seem different," she said gently. "I think I finally get it," I replied. "The land's not just mine to defend, it's ours to carry forward. Together." She nodded, content. "Your father would say you've finally grown into the land, and this time I didn't just believe it, I felt it. This story is more than just a battle over land and water. It's a reminder that standing up for what's right isn't always easy, but it's necessary. In today's world, we may not all be ranchers defending a creek, but many of us face situations where our boundaries, values, or resources are quietly threatened. Whether it's in our neighborhoods, workplaces, or families, we're often pressured to stay silent, to compromise, or to let things slide for the sake of convenience. But silence in the face of wrongdoing only empowers those who exploit it. This story teaches us that unity, truth, and persistence can expose even the most deeply rooted injustice. It also shows the power of community, how former enemies can become allies, and how lasting change begins when ordinary people decide enough is enough. So if you're facing your own version of a Cynthia in life, don't back down. Speak up. Document everything. Rally those who care. And remember, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to be silent.